The Four Noble Truths explained as the Buddha intended. There is a quiet ache that lives beneath the noise of our lives. It does not announce itself loudly. It hums. It lingers. It waits in the subtle tightening of the chest when something precious begins to slip away. It waits in the moment after laughter fades, in the silence after a screen goes dark. This ache is not a failure of life. It is not a punishment. It is not a personal mistake. It is the simple fact of being human. We are born into a world of change, yet we long for what does not change. We love deeply, yet everything we love is fragile. And so, even in moments of success, a quiet unease follows us like a shadow at noon. We build identities, roles, and stories, yet none of them remain intact for long. Not always visible, never completely absent. What emerged was not a belief to defend, nor a doctrine to obey, but a clear seeing, as simple and as radical as the truth itself. Long before modern anxiety had a name, before distraction became an industry, before speed replaced silence, a man sat beneath a tree and refused to turn away from this ache. He did not seek to escape it, drown it, or decorate it with meaning. He simply stayed. He watched. He listened. The Four Noble Truths were not offered as philosophy, not to judge life, but to understand it. They were offered as medicine, not to condemn desire, but to see it clearly, not to promise heaven, but to point toward freedom, here, in this very breath. Tonight, by this inner campfire, beneath the vast and silent sky of awareness, we return to these truths, not as ancient words, but as living insights that still breathe within our own experience. We begin where the Buddha began, with honesty, with courage. The first noble truth, seeing suffering without turning away. The first truth does not arrive with comfort, with the willingness to see what is already here. Life as it is ordinarily lived carries suffering. It arrives with clarity, not dramatic suffering alone. Not only illness, loss, or death, but the subtle dissatisfaction woven into ordinary moments. The tension beneath pleasure, the restlessness beneath achievement, the faint sorrow that even joy cannot entirely erase. This suffering is not a philosophical claim. It is an invitation to look. When the Buddha spoke of suffering, he did not point outward toward a broken world. He pointed inward toward an unexamined relationship with experience itself. Consider the body. It ages even as we try to preserve it. It weakens even as we strengthen it. It carries pain even in its healthiest moments, because pain is part of having nerves, bones, breath. Consider the mind. It wanders even when we ask it to stay. It clings even when it knows better. It replays old wounds and rehearses future fears, rarely resting in the simplicity of now. The sweetness of a moment contains the bitterness of its ending. Even pleasure, when observed closely, trembles with impermanence. This is not pessimism. The more tightly we hold joy, the faster it slips through our fingers. This is honesty. He said that suffering is woven into life when it is lived without understanding. The Buddha did not say life is only suffering. We suffer when we resist what is changing. We suffer when we mistake fleeting experiences for solid ground. We suffer when we demand certainty from a world that offers none. And yet, most of our lives are spent running from this truth. We distract ourselves. We entertain ourselves. We numb ourselves. We turn suffering into a problem to be solved rather than a message to be heard. But the Buddha did something radical. He stopped running. He sat with death, not abstractly, but intimately. He sat with sickness. He sat with aging. And in doing so, he discovered that suffering is not the enemy. Ignorance is. Suffering, when met with awareness, becomes a teacher. It reveals where we cling. It reveals where we fear. It reveals where we confuse what is impermanent for something that should last. We expect people to remain as they were. We expect feelings to stay pleasant. Think of how often disappointment arises not from events themselves, but from expectations quietly attached to them. We expect effort to guarantee outcome. The first noble truth is not asking you to despair. When these expectations are violated, as they inevitably are, suffering blooms. There is a strange relief in this honesty. It is asking you to stop pretending, to acknowledge the exhaustion of constantly holding life together with willpower and hope alone. The Buddha did not say life is suffering, therefore give up. He said look carefully and see clearly. When we finally admit that something is deeply unsatisfying, we no longer have to keep decorating it. We can stop telling ourselves that the next achievement, the next relationship, the next version of ourselves will finally silence the ache. See how craving tightens the chest. See how fear contracts the mind. See how identity hardens around what is fluid. This seeing requires courage, because when we truly look, we realize that suffering is not imposed upon us by fate, or gods, or society alone. It is shaped, moment by moment, by how we relate to experience. The first noble truth is a mirror. It reflects. It does not accuse. It reflects the cost of living unconsciously. And yet, within this truth is a profound compassion. It reflects the tension of wanting life to obey our preferences. It reflects the quiet violence of resisting reality. The Buddha did not speak these words from a throne, but from the ground. From the same dust, the same breath, the same vulnerability we inhabit now. He understood it completely. He did not exempt himself from suffering. To accept the first noble truth is not to become bleak. It is to become real. It is to stop waging war against life as it is, and to begin listening. And because he understood it, he refused to lie about it. When suffering is acknowledged without judgment, something softens. This is why the Buddha began here. When it is seen without panic, it loosens its grip. When it is understood, it no longer needs to shout, not with hope, not with transcendence, but with truth. Because only when we stop turning away from suffering can we discover that it is not the end of the path, but the doorway. The second noble truth, the origin of suffering seen without blame. Once suffering is seen clearly, a deeper question arises on its own, not as philosophy, but as lived inquiry. Why does the mind, even in comfort, lean toward unease? Why does dissatisfaction return even when circumstances improve? Why does this ache repeat itself? And that cause is not life itself, but our relationship to it. The Buddha did not answer this by pointing to fate, to original sin, or to a flawed world. He looked closer, not outward, but inward, to the movements of the heart and mind in each moment. Suffering, he saw, has a cause. At the center of this relationship is craving, not only for pleasure but for control, for certainty, for becoming something solid in a world that refuses to stay still. Craving is subtle. It does not always shout, I want. Often it whispers, I need, or this must not change, or only when this happens will I be at peace. Craving dresses itself in reasonable language. It calls itself ambition. It calls itself self-improvement. But when observed closely, craving always carries tension. It calls itself love. It narrows the mind. It tightens the body. It turns the present moment into a means to an imagined future. Even pleasant experiences become burdens under its weight. Now notice how that same joy changes when the mind says, I must keep this. Think of how joy feels when it is simple, a breeze on the skin, a quiet cup of tea, a moment of shared laughter. There is openness, ease, grasping follow. The moment contracts, fear enters. Craving does not only chase pleasure. We crave not to feel discomfort. It also runs from pain. We crave not to be forgotten, not to be alone, not to face uncertainty. We crave not to be judged. And so we push, resist, distract, suppress. Not because wanting is evil, but resistance too is a form of craving. The craving for experience, to be other than it is. The Buddha saw that this endless push and pull toward what we want, away from what we fear, is what keeps the wheel of suffering turning. At the heart of craving lies a misunderstanding, the belief that fulfillment lies somewhere else, in something more, in someone different, in a future version of ourselves. But because craving mistakes impermanent experiences for sources of lasting peace, not because pleasure is forbidden. In that division, we lose our footing. The present moment becomes a problem to solve, rather than a place to live. This belief quietly divides life into two parts. Now, which is insufficient, and later, which promises completion. Craving feeds on the idea of a solid self, a me who must be protected, enhanced, admired, secured. The body becomes an object to control rather than a process to feel. The mind becomes a project rather than a companion. But this self, when examined, is never as stable as it appears. From this clinging arises comparison. It is made of memories that shift, emotions that rise and fall, thoughts that appear and vanish like clouds. Yet we cling to it fiercely, defending it as if it were permanent. From pride, fear of loss. From fear, suffering. From comparison, envy and pride. The Buddha did not speak of this to assign blame. He did not say, "You are wrong for craving." He said, in effect, "Look at what craving does. Look at how it says just one more and then moves the finish line. Look at how it promises satisfaction and delivers restlessness. Look at how it keeps the heart leaning forward, rarely resting where it stands." Because when we understand the cause of suffering, we stop fighting the wrong battles. This seeing is not meant to shame the mind, but to free it. We stop blaming people for not filling the emptiness they were never meant to fill. Instead, attention turns inward, not with judgment, but with curiosity. We stop blaming life for behaving like life. We stop blaming ourselves for not achieving a peace that no achievement can secure. What story does it tell? What does it feel like in the body? How does craving arise in this moment? Not because it is suppressed, but because it is understood. It loosens. When craving is seen clearly, something remarkable happens. The Buddha compared this process not to punishment, but to healing. You would not shame a wound for being infected. You would clean it, gently, patiently, until it can close. Understanding the origin of suffering reveals something quietly hopeful. Suffering is not random. Like a flame deprived of fuel, craving fades when it is no longer fed by ignorance. It arises from causes, and what has a cause can also have an end. It follows pattern. It tells us that peace is not imported from outside, but uncovered within. This is why the second noble truth is not despairing. It is empowering. It tells us that freedom does not depend on rearranging the world, but on seeing clearly how we cling to it. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that we are not broken. We are simply caught in habits of mind that can be seen, understood, and gently released. The Buddha did not promise instant liberation, not by erasing desire, but by understanding it. Not by rejecting life, but by meeting it without grasping. He offered something more honest, a path of awareness that begins exactly where we are. When craving is seen as the origin of suffering, compassion naturally arises for ourselves and for others. We see that behind anger is behind greed is insecurity, behind cruelty is confusion, and in that seeing, the heart softens. The second noble truth does not ask us to become perfect, to notice, moment by moment, the subtle movements that pull us away from peace. It asks us to become aware. And in that noticing, the possibility of freedom quietly appears, not as a distant ideal, but as a direction already unfolding beneath our feet. If suffering has a cause, then it can cease. When the Buddha spoke of the end of suffering, he did not speak in grand promises or distant heavens. He spoke quietly, precisely, as one describing a fire going out when it is no longer fed. The third and fourth noble truths, the end of suffering and the path that grows beneath our feet. This was not offered as hope in the abstract, but as something to be verified through direct experience. It does not mean the world stops changing. The end of suffering does not mean the end of pain. It does not mean life becomes smooth, predictable, or endlessly pleasant. It means something far more subtle and far more radical. It means the end of clinging. When craving fades, even momentarily, the heart tastes a different kind of freedom. Not excitement, not numbness, but a quiet ease that does not depend on conditions. A moment when something you desperately wanted slipped away, and instead of collapse, there was relief. You may have felt this already, without naming it. A moment when an old identity loosened its grip, and space appeared. In those moments, suffering was absent, not because life was perfect, but because resistance was gone. A moment when the mind stopped arguing with what was, and simply rested. This is what the Buddha meant by liberation. Not escape from life, but intimacy with it without grasping. The third noble truth points to this possibility. It says, peace is not something you manufacture. It is something you uncover when the causes of suffering are no longer present. This freedom is often misunderstood. It is not indifference. Just as silence appears when noise ends, freedom appears when craving releases its hold. In fact, when clinging dissolves, compassion. It is not withdrawal from the world. It is not emotional coldness. Without fear of loss, love becomes generous rather than possessive. Without the constant pressure of protecting a fragile self, the heart has room to care. Without the obsession with becoming, there is space for being. This is where the fourth noble truth gently enters, not as a commandment, but as a path worn by careful footsteps. But how does one arrive here? The Buddha called this peace unshakable, not because nothing changes, but because the mind no longer demands that it shouldn't. The path is not linear. It is not a ladder to climb. It is a way of walking. Wisdom begins with seeing clearly. It unfolds as wisdom, ethical living, and mental cultivation, not as separate practices, but as interwoven strands of a single life lived with awareness. Seeing impermanence not as an idea, but as a lived truth. Seeing that clinging brings tension, while letting go brings ease. Seeing that the self we defend so fiercely is more fluid than we imagine. This wisdom is not cold analysis. It is intimacy with experience. When we understand that others suffer as we do, cruelty becomes harder to justify. Ethical living arises naturally from this seeing. Ethics, in this sense, is not about obedience. When we see the consequences of our actions clearly, care replaces carelessness. When the illusion of separateness softens, compassion becomes a natural response rather than a moral obligation. It is about alignment, living in ways that reduce harm to ourselves and others because we have seen what harm costs. Mental cultivation is the quiet work of training attention, learning to stay, learning to notice, learning to respond rather than react. None of this happens overnight. The Buddha never suggested it would. Through mindfulness, the mind becomes less reactive, less entangled in old patterns. Through concentration, it gathers itself, becoming steady and clear. Through insight, it understands its own movements and releases what no longer serves. Life is no longer something that happens to you. This path is walked breath by breath, moment by moment, often stumbling, often beginning again. But something profound shifts when one commits to walking it. It becomes something you participate in consciously. Pain still rises, but it does not define you. Loss still comes, but it does not destroy you. Change continues, but it no longer feels like betrayal. The fourth noble truth does not promise a final arrival. It offers a way of being with kindness instead of grasping. A way of meeting each moment with clarity instead of confusion, with presence instead of escape. No identity to cling to as awakened. And perhaps the most beautiful aspect of this path is its humility. There is no special status to attain. What remains is simplicity. The more deeply this path is walked, the less important the walker becomes. No finish line that separates you from others. Breath, mind, body. The Buddha did not ask the world to change before peace could arise. This moment as it is, he asked us to see clearly, here and now, to notice how suffering forms, to notice how it fades, to trust that freedom grows not from force, but from understanding. As the fire beside us settles into embers and the sky stretches wide and silent above, there is nothing more to add. This is the heart of the Four Noble Truths, not doctrine, but discovery, not something to believe in, but something to live. The Four Noble Truths are not ancient relics. They are mirrors held gently to our own experience. They ask us to be honest about suffering, curious about its causes, trusting of its ending, patient with the path that leads us home. The path begins exactly where you are sitting now, in the texture of this breath, the weight of this body, the movements of this mind. You do not need to escape your life, fix yourself, or wait for ideal conditions. You do not need to become someone else to walk this path. Let them unfold over time. If these reflections have stirred something quiet within you, not excitement but recognition, then the teachings are already doing their work. Return to them slowly. This channel exists as a place of refuge, a place to pause, to listen, to remember what is easily forgotten in a loud and restless world. If you wish to continue walking together, breath by breath, truth by truth, you are welcome here. Allow understanding to ripen in its own season. May your seeing deepen. May your clinging soften. May your heart discover the peace that does not depend on conditions. And when suffering arises, as it inevitably will, may it be met not with fear, but with wisdom, compassion, and the quiet confidence of one who knows the way.